Welcome to this webinar at the launch of Think Factory Security, Peace and Public Policy Initiatives. In brief, SAPI. SAPI's newly set up think tank launched in October 2021 at the hands of Shri Dutt, former governor and former defense secretary, Dr. Sivathanu Pillai, distinguished scientist of DRDO and founder, CEO and managing director of Brahmos Aerospace Private Limited, and Shri Arvind Gupta, director of Vivekananda International Foundation, who had been former Deputy NSA and DG IDSA too. It is the endeavor of SAPI to be a platform to create fresh grounds for cross-pollination of ideas and deliver value to society in the field of security, peace and public policy. In this part, Shri Arvind Gupta, an eminent strategic affairs expert and presently director of prestigious Vivekananda International Foundation, who also had been Deputy NSA and DG of IDSA before, expresses his thoughts and ideas as keynote speaker on the subject of improvement of border management.
Let me begin by first congratulating SAPI for a brilliant launch. So I think we have to look at the borders, as Mr. Gupta said, in a different way altogether. And that is, I just want to make a few points in this regard. First, I think we have to realize that borderlands are of any country are subject to diverse influences. The peripheries of a country are extremely important, and we have to pay special attention to them. Failure to do so can land us in very serious trouble and have serious consequences for a country's security and prosperity. So borders are as important or even more important in some ways than the hinterland. But that is something that doesn't come to us. This kind of a frame of mind does not come to us naturally. The fact is that settled, peaceful, and relatively open borders are a source of security and prosperity. And that is why in many regions of the world, the attempts are made to keep the borders relatively regulated, open and free for trade and human traffic. And it is the borders which define neighbors and our relations with them. So bilateral relations with neighboring countries become very important. Now, look at India's borders. But before you look at them, you have to realize that India is a civilizational state. We have a 5,000 plus old history. So it's, and our borders, in fact, there was no borders earlier. We had our cultural footprint extended far beyond our present boundaries. Unfortunately, with the partition of India, what emerged was a geographically diminished India. The boundaries drawn were artificial and arbitrary. Pakistan was created out of a very pernicious mindset called the two-nation theory, and it resulted in huge violence. And the legacy of India-Pakistan border is very complex, very bloody, and it is still with us. And in fact, the boundaries that we have with Pakistan and with Bangladesh, etc., were drawn over a period of about 6 weeks, on a map by a person who had never visited India before, and he had just a few maps on which he to the border, Red Cliff. And if you look at our northern borders with Tibet, India had civilizational links, Buddhism, trade, people, coming, crossing, whether it is Ladakh or in the east. We had very strong civilizational links with Tibet, and they still are very strong, except that now our borders are not with Tibet, but it's with China. And that is because China annexed Tibet in 1949-50, and we kept quiet at that point of time. And for the first time, we had a border with China, which we never had civilization. And now we have a China which is rising, which is a dragon, which is assertive, right on our borders with a unsettled boundary and no hope of the boundary settlement in the near future. And the result is that today, last year, you know what happened in Galwan, and there are possibilities of even more border tensions, despite so many agreements and protocols and confidence building measures that we have signed with China. It's a huge border, which is uh, the as I think Mr. Gupta also said, the nature of borders does not remain constant. It is always changing, whether it is due to population changes, whether it is changes in terrain, and I think due to climate change, there's a lot of terrain changing that is happening, whether it is the economic development, there are migrations all the time, and all these developments impact the nature of the borders. So border management can never be a static exercise, and we have to be always be ahead of and anticipate changes and be ahead of it. Further, we are living in an era of globalization, not just globalization, but hyper globalization. And some of the technologies that we are talking about is also shrunk the world. And globalization requires that there should be the people and the goods and services. They should cross the borders relatively easily and without hassles. And yet we have this huge problem of illegal migrations. And the Corona crisis ensured that border controls were reimposed, and that, in some sense, was a setback for the globalization processes also. So while we would very much like to have open borders, but I think we have to be realistic also. Wishful thinking is not going to help, and we have to manage our borders given the present day realities. So, border management as a component of national security, as a part of our plans for prosperity, becomes very important. And that is why I think a professional management of borders also is the need of the hour. Just briefly summarize the Indian borders. I think all of you know it, but it's still, for the context, it's necessary to just to mention a few points. We all know that India has 15,000 kilometers of land borders and 7,500 kilometers of coastal borders, coast. And then we have several, I think about 12, 1,300 island territories. The land borders, 456 blocks of 119 border districts in 16 states and 2 union territories. They abut the international boundary. So you can see, and of course, many states have the coastal boundaries. So you can see, except for a few states in the central part of India, every other state has some kind of an international boundary or a coastal boundary. So we cannot, and we have open seas on 3 sides, Himalayas on the north, etc. So border management is a very complex task. We have to, every border becomes unique, and we have to handle them very professionally and effectively. And there are also, of course, riverine borders, which have their own problems. Coastal borders, they have own problems. So in the Indian context, I would like to just identify a few features that stand out as we speak. India has borders with Bangladesh, which is 4,096 kilometers, Pakistan 3,300 kilometers, China about 3,400 kilometers, Nepal 1,700 kilometers, Bhutan 699 kilometers, and Myanmar 1,643 kilometers. These are huge boundaries and all different terrains. Another important point to note here is the sections of boundaries are unsettled. And as I said, this is a huge problem. With Pakistan, we have unsettled boundaries. There's this line of control which is highly militarized. And now we're seeing that our line of actual control is de facto getting militarized. And we have open borders with Nepal. And then the borders with Myanmar are also highly forested and very porous. And another is that the neighbors with whom we have borders are often hostile. And that makes the problem of border management that much difficult. So bilateral relations also play a very big role. And the borders also in turn impact our bilateral relations. Terrains are diverse and difficult, and border areas, this is a very important point, borders areas are relatively underdeveloped as compared to the hinterland areas. Connectivity with hinterland and across other countries is generally poor. Border populations feel insecure. Border areas in remote parts are getting depopulated, a very serious concern. Illegal migrations, which alter demographic ratios, present a major challenge. The smuggling of contrabands, arms, ammunition, drugs, etc., is rampant. So all these factors will have to be taken into account when we talk about border management. We have border guarding forces, which guard these borders. They're doing a fantastic job, but I think they are also under pressure of material and financial resources, training, and also the border guarding management, border guarding forces have to have a particular aptitude for border management. It is not simply that you are fighting. I mean, the armed forces, army, etc., they are trained to fight and to kill, but this is not the case with the border management. So their training, etc., and mindset has to be very different. So, in the light of these complex factors, border management requires a strategy and a holistic multi-stakeholder approach, as Mr. Gupta said. In the wake of the Kargil conflict, the government set up 4 task forces to review the national management, security management system in the country. And one of these task forces was on border management. That was the first time we looked at the borders holistically as part of national security management. And the recommendations of the task forces were accepted by a group of ministers. But I think if you look back now, that was more than almost 20 years ago, we still looked at borders in a restricted sense. As a part of that the task force recommendations, a border management, a Department of Border Management was set up. In fact, there used to be border area development program actually as a cell in the Planning Commission way back in the 90s. That was transferred to the Ministry of Home Affairs, and around that a cell was made, and finally Department of Border, full-fledged Department of Border Management has been created, and Mr. Pradeep Gupta was Joint Secretary in one of those units there. So we have this department which is spearheading the border management efforts in the country. And some of the tasks it has performed are the construction of the border guarding infrastructure, construction of integrated checkposts to facilitate trade and movement of people, and also socio-economic development of facilitating socio-economic development of border areas. So MHA also equips and trains the border guarding forces. These are the different divisions that handle that. And this principle of one border, one force was accepted by the government, which was the recommendation of the GOM. And as a result, we have streamlined the deployment of border guarding forces, etc. A lot of money is being spent, and I think the budgets are increasing. One of our experiences is that there is a need for close coordination between the center and the state agencies. This is not often the case. This is one of the weaknesses, in fact. Land is a state subject. Building infrastructure requires land and environmental clearances and a host of other approvals. So the complexity of center-state relations, which impact so much of governance in our countries, also affects border management. And this task becomes that much more difficult if the center and state do not pull in the same direction. States are often see the presence of central agencies on the border areas with some kind of disapproval. I think we need to improve central-state coordination, and a special effort needs to be made in that. India spends a large amount of resources in building, has spent in building fences, which started getting built way back in the 80s, and the associated infrastructure over the last 3 decades. It has speeded up. Things are much better now, but yet, there's a huge maintenance also that is required. But more important, I think we also need to build the capabilities of the border guarding forces to guard and manage the borders, which is a task which is never ending and requires a huge amount of resources and attention. But I think overall, if you look at last experience of last 20 years or so, but since the GOM, the impact has been positive. We have the infiltrations have gone down, smuggling has gone down, cattle smuggling has gone down, curbing of cross the contraband and smuggling, etc., has gone down. And I think MHA has also professionalized the border guarding forces, like the BSF and the SSB, and there are other border guarding forces like the ITBP, Assam Rifles, and also for coast we have Coast Guards and Indian Navy, etc. So there are many, apart from the MHA, many other departments like the Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Commerce, Railways, all kinds of departments are involved. So huge number of stakeholders are there. The MHA tries to get them all together, but it is not an easy task. And so, while we have done well, but I think the problems still remain. And some of the factors are not in our control. For instance, what happens in the neighboring states. Terrorism has grown. We have seen drug trafficking is on upward trajectory. With the change in Afghanistan, I think we can see an upsurge, uptick in terrorism, radicalization, contraband smuggling, drugs in particular. And then also the health, the law and order on the seas, that is also extremely important. So some of these factors are not in our control. We require international cooperation, etc. Some of the factors we can certainly attend to. Border areas require more connectivity and more socio-economic activity. If you don't have that, you'll end up spending more and more on, which is essentially policing the borders. As I said, the peripheries require a very different approach. The border areas require more security. The people who are staying there, they require security and also reasons as to why they should remain rooted in their homes on the borders, because the life on borders is very tough. Also, illegal migrations from the border areas can be highly destabilizing. So the border management needs to take all these factors into account. Now, there are some special areas, corners of the country, which require special attention. Northeast is one of them. Northeast is the gateway to ASEAN, which is relatively a prosperous area. India is committed to improving connectivity with ASEAN. The vision of connecting ASEAN with Asia through India is laudable, but there are many problems and the progress has been very slow. The issue in regard to the Northeast is the lack of connectivity, which is now improving, of course, but still lack of connectivity and the non-realization of the developmental potential of the region. See, the point here is that if you provide connectivity to the Northeast and the Northeast is not fully developed, then Northeast will only become a transit area, which is not good for the region. It also should be adding value and become a hub of economic activity, so that in export and imports, it takes a full participation. So the developmental aspects of Northeast, that is also very important. Often we fear that if we open the borders with Myanmar, the region will be swamped with Chinese goods and also, insurgents and drug trafficking, etc. And I think these fears are not misplaced. But the answer is not to create fences, but the answer is to do a multidimensional development in the Northeast. And it's a problem which MHA alone or the Department of Border Management alone cannot solve. They can certainly have a border guarding force and some border infrastructure. But beyond that, I think many other stakeholders are required. Now, let me briefly talk about the coastal borders. I'm not talking on the western borders and so on, because I think we can take that in Q&A. Otherwise, my talk will become too long. But also the coastal borders, the problem is a totally different and of a different scale altogether. The Mumbai terror attacks, I think, brought home the need to strengthen coastal surveillance and coastal security, maritime security. Coast Guard patrols the territorial seas, and the Indian Navy operates in the high seas. The two work together, and there are also the police stations, maritime police stations, which are there in various states. But I think many of these institutions are not working in sync with each other. There are also the issues of manning these institutions, and also the resources, training, and so on. There is, of course, a committee under the cabinet secretary which looks into these issues, but some improvements are there. But the problem is so huge, particularly of the maritime region, and that it is not easy to deal with the 7,500 kilometers long course and even beyond. Sea routes are used for all kinds of nefarious activities. I don't have to dwell in that. One of the issues which has been flagged very often is that lakhs and lakhs of small boats and ships pass through the Indian coast, near the Indian coast and Indian seas, Indian territorial waters, and near territorial waters. Monitoring them requires a coordinated approach based on use of technology. The Indian Navy has set up a fusion center to create maritime domain awareness, which is a very positive step. But just having a fusion center is not enough. We have to take action also if there are some problems. International cooperation becomes also very important when it comes to the maritime security, of which coastal security is a part. Now we are hearing that the government is thinking of setting up a maritime commission. This idea is almost as old as the Kargil Review Committee, but it has yet not come into force. But once a maritime commission is set up, I think we will be able to have a greater focus on coastal security and maritime security generally, and this will improve the coordination amongst stakeholders and also improve monitoring and surveillance. I think we also need to pay a lot of attention to strengthening coastal police, because that works very close to the coast. The problems of island territories require a special focus and approach. Mr. Pradeep Gupta had also worked on this area at that point of time. Andaman and Nicobar Islands are highly strategic as well as ecologically fragile. And they are in the Bay of Bengal. They are like unsinkable aircraft carriers. So Andaman Nicobar will require a very special approach, how we develop them and how we utilize them, and also at the same time not destroy them. The same can be said of the Lakshadweep Islands as well. So island territories also will require a different approach, because they are a part of our borderlands. You also know that South Asia is the least integrated region of the world, and that is unfortunate because there are natural affinities between the people of the region, but instability in the region has impeded integration. Now, lack of integration means more and more problems. So it has been our policy to get the South Asian countries together. Unfortunately, the SARC experiment has not succeeded, but we are now working on a sub-regional cooperation, and that is why BBIN, that is Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Nepal, that is one grouping, or BIMSTEC, that is another grouping. I think these become very important. BIMSTEC particularly because it connects the ASEAN with South Asia. There has been some progress in connectivity, which goes across the borders, particularly the transport connectivity, electricity connectivity. Electricity connectivity, as you know, has changed the face of Bhutan, and today we are also exporting almost 1,300 megawatts of power to Bangladesh. Now, why am I mentioning this is not strictly called border management, But these are the areas which impact, these are the factors which impact our borders, the well-being of our borders, and the border management is a part of that. So while we talk about border management, these issues also have to be kept, because we cannot do a border management and adopt those practices which impede these kind of integrations, because that's also part of our foreign policy and part of our ability to harness the potential of the region for our own security and prosperity. So the approaches that have been adopted by the Department of Border Management, I would like to suggest they look at only a limited aspect of the overall border problem, but and leave out the others because it is not in their charter. So we really need maybe a kind of a border management commission, which brings together a number of stakeholders and resources, etc. And we should have a 24 by 7 idea about what is happening on our borders, which will require a lot of information exchange. I think today we can use technology to create that kind of awareness about the borders, what is happening, which so I think technology should be harnessed to create this border management, to create awareness about all our borders. I should be able to know, sitting in Delhi or different parts of the country, what is happening in a particular border at a given point of time, and it should be possible. I think this is something that SAPI can probably look at. So how do you use space technologies, IT, and also the new kinds of building materials and infrastructure construction technologies for better management and coordination? In developing good border management policies, we also should be aware that in making and implementing border management policies, states have to adhere to their obligations under the international law. So there is a very strong element of international law which comes into border management, which is often not fully appreciated. For instance, the Human Rights Conventions, the Geneva Conventions on International Humanitarian Law, the WTO Doha Development Agenda, the Addis Ababa Action Plan, the UN Conventions Against Transnational Organized Crime and several protocols, the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy, and also the UN Sustainable Development Goal, etc., are all relevant. Why? Because India is a party to most of these conventions, and many of these, require crossing the borders. Border management practices will have to be also in sync with the international requirements. Let me quote from a paper which was published by the International Organization for Migrations, which is a UN agency, and India is a part of that. And I'm just quoting a few lines so that you understand how border management is looked at. So I quote, good border management serves a dual purpose, helping balance a state's interest in both facilitating cross-border movements and maintaining security. So you see, there is always this tension between cross-border movements and maintaining security. And I think any border management practice will have to resolve that tension. And I again quote, achieving this balance depends upon border management policies and interventions focused on 4 areas of work. One is identity management. Two is border management information system. Three is integrated border management. And four is humanitarian border management. So you could see that how I think for SAPI, there are some points from this quotation that can help them to choose some of their research areas. So friends, India is in the process of evolving a robust and balanced border management system that balances cross-border flows with the national security interests. We need to study and evolve good border management practices, and SAPI can help in doing that by undertaking research and studies in the field of border management. Border management is not just deploying border guarding forces on the border. We need to think through the issues more deeply. And I'm glad that SAPI will be attending to some of these issues. These issues are very relevant in the making of an Atmanirbhar Bharat. As a unique think tank, SAPI will be able to draw attention to these issues of border management, do cutting edge research, bring many people together, generate new ideas to promote a truly multi stakeholder approach to border management. I think if we do not have any think tank in the government which does this in a dedicated fashion, and SAPI can very easily, fill that gap. And I wish you success in that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for a very thorough and 360-degree perspective on border management, sir. It was great to hear about the various border management strategies currently being utilized and how it all came into being. And especially, we appreciate the points that you have mentioned about how in this entire ecosystem, SAPI could play its role. So we will definitely take those points into serious consideration and develop our strategy further so that we align ourselves with the points that you have just mentioned.